My name is Justina Barrett. I'm the Director of Education here at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and we are looking at our 200th anniversary next year in 2024. HSP is proud to serve as Philadelphia's Library of American History. Our collection of over 21 million manuscripts, books, and graphic items tell an inclusive story of American history. Some of our strengths include early American history, genealogical research, minority and ethnic studies, and science, technology, and the arts. We have a great panel here to talk to us today, so I'm going to go through just a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get started. We do have closed captioning available, so if you see at the bottom of your Zoom bar, you have a CC button. If you can hit that, you'll be able to get that closed captioning. We are recording this, and we will be sending it out to everybody who has registered. We are Zooming in live from 1300 Locust Street in Center City, Philadelphia. And today, the reading room and the library are open. So you may hear some background noises of people librarying, getting books, doing some research, moving about. We do have a Zoom audience with us, and we have some of our panelists here in the room, and some of them are on Zoom. We are also in webinar mode, so we cannot see you and you cannot see each other. We will be asking you for questions for our Q&A to use the Q&A box and put them in there, and we will have time at the end to go through that Q&A as well. Okay, let's get started, and let me introduce some of our speakers today. First, our moderator, Dr. James Wolfinger. He is the Dean of the School of Education at St. John's University. He holds a joint appointment in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, as well as in the Department of History. He is the editor of If There Is No Struggle, There Is No Progress, Black Politics in 20th Century Philadelphia. He also wrote the introduction. We have it for sale here on site, and we will be sending out the Temple Press connection to you in the chat and in a follow-up email, so you all can purchase that book if you're compelled by what you're hearing today, which I think you will be. No stranger to our reading room. You have previously authored Philadelphia Divided, Race and Politics in the City of Brotherly Love, and Running the Rails, Capital and Labor in Philadelphia Transit in the Philadelphia transit industry. And he's also one of the contributing authors to our upcoming publication celebrating our 200th anniversary. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Jim, have a seat. On site, we'll also be joined by Dr. Abigail Perkis. She's Associate Professor of History at Kean University. Her first book, Making Good Neighbors, Civil Rights, Liberalism, and Integration in Post-War Philadelphia, examines the creation of intentionally integrated neighborhoods in the latter half of the 20th century. Her second book, developed with Kean undergraduate students as an oral history project, documents the uneven recovery from Hurricane Sandy along New Jersey's coastline. It's titled Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey's Forgotten Shore. Dr. Abby, can we pull that up? Great. We're also joined on site by Dr. Clem Harris. He's Associate Professor of History and the inaugural Director of Africana Studies at Utica University. His current book manuscript is titled Reconstructing Philadelphia, the Persistence of Racism and the African-American Struggle for Political Power and Civil Rights in the Urban North. It examines the role of electoral and protest activism in the fight for racial reform in the urban North in the abolition era, all the way to the 1980s. It's great to have you, Clem. Do you want to join us here? And that's just in the room. On Zoom, we have a few more panelists as well. So while I introduce our other panelists, they can come on screen. First, we'll be joined by Dr. Stanley Arnold, zooming in from Illinois, where he is Associate Professor of History at Northern Illinois University. His first, do you want to say hi, Dr. Arnold?
Hello.
Good to have you.
Good afternoon.
Across time zones. His first book, Building the Beloved Community, Philadelphia's Interracial Civil Rights Movement and the Origins of Multiculturalism, 1930 to 1970, examined the role of locally based interracial civil rights movement here in Philadelphia through the stories of several organizations. His current book project is Beacons of Their Race, African Americans and the Olympic Movement, 1896 to 1948. It explores the impact of African Americans on the Olympic Games. Great to hear from you. And finally, also on Zoom, zooming in from Florida, is Dr. David Canton. He's the director of African American Study of the African American Studies program and associate professor of history. Professor Canton is the author of Raymond Pace Alexander, A New Negro Lawyer Fights the Civil Rights in Philadelphia, which won the 2011 W.E.D. Du Bois Book Award from the Northeast Black Studies Association. Currently, he is writing a biography titled Biography of a Black Scholar, Lawrence Dunbar Reddick. So we are excited for that project as well. Dr. Canton, you want to say hi?
Good morning. My video is not coming up.
Okay, well, we will work with you to make sure it is before we get to your talk. And if not, I think you have a PowerPoint, so we will be able to see your PowerPoint when Jim hands the mic over to you.
Yes.
Okay. Obviously, we have a lot of ground to cover. We are talking about the 20th century, and we're going to not cover, I think, all of it, but we are definitely going to do some dives into it. Jim, I'm going to hand the mic over to you.
Great.
All right.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's great to see folks in the room today and to have an audience joining us online as well. This book has been a labor of love for 5 years now. I was telling people it was 4 years, and Clem reminded me last night it's actually now been 5 years. So that's kind of the way time moves in higher ed circles sometimes. About 5 years ago, an editor from Temple University Press approached me and asked what great works were being produced about African-American history in Philadelphia by rising scholars, some people may be working on second books. So we got together at the American Historical Association to talk about what I knew was happening in the field. And I was saying there are so many young scholars producing such great work that you could really do an edited collection and pull together the insights from many different scholars who each had something to say about Black politics in Philadelphia. And after about an hour of conversation, she said, "That's great. When do you start?" And I thought, uh-oh, I think I just signed up for a project. But it's really been a labor of love. I've been able to work with some really impressive scholars who offer wonderful insights about understanding Black politics in Philadelphia over what we call the long 20th century or the long civil rights movement sometimes. So this book starts at the very tail end of the 19th century, and it goes all the way into the second decade of the 21st century. So it covers a long span of time. If you take a look at the book, what you'll find is that while each chapter is written by a different author, and each author has a different focus, sometimes it's about gender, sometimes it's about grassroots organizing or formal political realignments, but all of it comes together to have a real focus on changing demographics of the city of Philadelphia, economic opportunity, and what that means for formal and informal politics across a long century of time in Philadelphia. So each author has an opportunity to speak with their voice, but at the same time participate in a larger project that I think hangs together to give readers a real sense of Black politics in Philadelphia over the course of about 120 years. So in today's presentation, what we'll do is I'm going to start by briefly sketching an outline of the book, and then we have 4 of our authors joining us, each of whom will spend about 10 minutes or so talking about the contribution they made to the larger volume. And then we'll have a half an hour or so at the end of our time together for question and answer with the audience, either online or face-to-face here in the room. So we look forward to engaging with you and hearing more about your questions and your thinking about Philadelphia's history as well. So you can see the PowerPoint presentation here on the screen. If there is no struggle, there is no progress, the history of Black politics in 20th century Philadelphia. I begin the book with an epigraph from this man, Frederick Douglass. And Douglass, one of the great African-American leaders of the 19th century, gave a speech in 1857. It's the West India Emancipation Speech. I'm just going to read the epigraph for you because this is where the the book title comes from. So quoting Frederick Douglass, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one. And it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And I think that's a nice opening to understanding Black politics in Philadelphia over the course of the long 20th century. So let me sketch for you very briefly what all the different chapters come together to argue, and then we'll be able to dip in more specifics with the authors who are here today. Book starts after the Civil War period when Philadelphia has a very small African-American population, a few thousand people. There's activism in the city. Octavius Catto is the leader of that activism in the decades after the Civil War, agitating for laws to end segregation, to combat segregation in the education system, and so on. And he is ultimately assassinated, shot and killed in 1871. Despite those tensions within the city, the conflicts around race, the Black community grows over the course of the late 19th century and into the early 20th. And even before World War I, you can see the growth of institutions from within the Black community. Think about Douglas Hospital, think about the Philadelphia Tribune, W.B. Du Bois is here writing a sociological study of the Black community, and so on. African Americans are deeply embedded in the Republican Party, not so much because the Republicans were always great for them, but because the Democrats were known as the party of the South, as the party of reaction coming out of the Civil War. So they were Republican, but not necessarily because they were getting what they needed from the party, but there was nowhere else to turn. The Great Migration of the World War I period brings tens of thousands of African Americans to Philadelphia, as well as New York, Boston, Chicago, and other cities across the North. Obviously, African Americans are fleeing the kind of racial oppression of the South, but at the same time, there's an opening of economic opportunity in the North because of immigration being pinched off by World War I. So African Americans are moving to Philadelphia to take jobs at employers like the Pennsylvania Railroad, Baldwin Locomotive, area shipyards, the Philadelphia Rapid Transportation Company, and so on. Their population by 1920, the end of the Great Migration era, reaches 134,000 people. Most African Americans who are moving to Philadelphia in that era are coming up the Eastern Seaboard. You can see the way the transportation systems work, essentially following the railroad lines. So most Black Philadelphians who move here in the early 20th century are coming from Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia, whereas Chicago and Detroit are drawing populations from what they call the Old Southwest. Think Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and you can see the way those migration flows are taking place. As the African-American population in Philadelphia grows, there's an opportunity for this kind of flowering of Black culture in the city. It's akin to the Harlem Renaissance that's more famous in New York, but we can see it happening in Philadelphia as well, with playwrights and authors, with theaters and so on, growing as the population grows and as there's more money in their pockets to be able to support the cultural industry. David Canton, one of our speakers today, his chapter on the 1920s in part talks about the connections between politics and culture. The 1920s seem like this kind of hopeful time, although there continues to be conflict in the city, most famously in 1918 with the race riots. But there's this kind of hopefulness in the Black community that maybe things could possibly be different. James Grossman's book about Chicago in the era is called Land of Hope. And that gives a sense of how African Americans were thinking about the urban North might be something different. But we all know what's coming by the end of the 1920s. 1929, you have the Great Depression and the economic crash. And what you see is that there's this old saying that if white America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. And if you look around in Philadelphia, the unemployment rate in white Philadelphia is about 25%. The unemployment rate in Black Philadelphia hits 61%. So you can see 2.5 times the unemployment rate in Black Philadelphia. It's the old adage of last hired, first fired, right? So African Americans, while there's a sense of hope in the 1920s, the 30s is a time of increasing desperation, and that leads to some political realignments. Most obviously, African Americans are moving from the Republican Party to the Democrats. It's not an even straight trajectory. It's not that people were Republican one day and they switched jerseys and became Democrats the next. It's an uneven movement. In part, African Americans in 1936, 1940, and 44 are much more willing to vote for Franklin Roosevelt because of his New Deal policies. And at the same time, in local elections, they were more likely to continue to vote for Republican candidates for mayor, for governor, for city council, and so on. So it's this uneven time. African Americans are also beginning to look at more radical alternatives to the Democratic Party. The two most obvious examples, the National Negro Congress and the Communist Party. Because of this kind of leftist impulse, you can see greater grassroots activism in the city around "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaigns, push for public housing, equal rights law in 1935, and so on. The Depression is a moment of real kind of political and cultural ferment in the Black community, and that really takes on jet fuel with the rise of World War II. Economic contracts flowing into the city, businesses gearing back up coming out of the Depression. The Black population surges again because of what's called the Second Great Migration, which is actually a much larger population movement than the first one back in the 19-teens. The Black population of Philadelphia hits 250,000 in 1940, and in 1950, about 5 years after the end of World War II, census shows the Black population is now at 376,000 people. So there's this huge growth of the Black population as people come to take jobs in the shipyards, munitions plants, and so on. And that growth of the Black population means there's going to be greater activism again. Most famously nationally is A. Philip Randolph and the March on Washington movement, which pushes President Franklin Roosevelt to develop what's called the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which is the forerunner of now our Equal Employment Opportunities Committee, or the EEOC. So it's federal support of Black rights. But in addition to pushing Franklin Roosevelt for rights, you also have the Double V campaign, which means victory over fascism abroad and over Jim Crow at home. And here locally, you also have the rise of a new activist leader, a woman named Carolyn Davenport Moore, who takes over the NAACP. And the NAACP, until the 1940s, was kind of known as a more elitist organization. It's more about cultural events, cello concerts, and luncheons and these kinds of things. And Moore makes it more about getting out and campaigning in the streets. Her greatest campaign takes place with the Philadelphia transit industry in 1944. 1943 and 44, the Black community starts campaigning to say, we should be able to have equal rights on the workforce, equal job opportunities with the transportation company. You can see the signs here. We drive tanks, why not trolleys? Race discrimination breeds fascism, and so on. Tying World War II to Black rights. So Carolyn Moore is very much an activist organizer out in the community. And with 44, what happens is that the FEPC, that government agency, comes in and tells the transit company, you must promote African Americans to the position of driver. About 8 people are told they'll get these promotions. The entire white workforce, minus a few hundred leftists, walks off the job 8 weeks after D-Day. Franklin Roosevelt says, this endangers the war effort. He sends 5,000 armed troops into Philadelphia to enforce Black rights, sets up sandbag foxholes on major intersections, brings in machine guns, and tells the drivers, either you will return to work within a week, or you will go fight the Nazis in France. It's your choice. They decide it's better off to come back and drive buses, right? So there's this moment that the federal government steps in to enforce Black rights. It's because of World War II, but it's a moment that takes place. And it's not that the federal government does it because it feels that it's the right thing to do so much as it's doing it because World War II is an imperative. As you move into the post-war period, Philadelphia politics finally begins to change across the city. Philadelphia is one of the very last Republican-dominated political cities in the country. The Democrats don't take over here until the 1950s. And it's led by Joseph Clark and Richardson Dilworth. And what they know as they move through the 1950s to 1960, that the Black population is surging to over 500,000 people in this city. And when it hits 25, 30% of the city's population, You cannot win as a Democrat if you don't have the support of Black Philadelphians. So they do move over to supporting some African Americans for office. Robert N.C. Nix Sr. is the first congressman, African American congressman elected from Philadelphia, 1958. And that means Philadelphia is finally catching up to Chicago, that had already elected William Dawson, New York City, that had already elected Adam Clayton Powell. Excuse me. As African Americans are taking greater formal political power in the city, what are they finding? They're finding that as you move into the 1960s, deindustrialization, suburbanization, tax base is shrinking, employment opportunities are shrinking. So just as they're getting more political power, they're finding that they are losing their economic base. So they have to deal with a whole other set of problems that are out of the ordinary for what the city had experienced in the past. There's an old liberal vanguard led by Raymond Pace and Sadie Alexander and some of their allies. They have a perspective on Black politics that is very much about a liberal view. This is a good country. The rules are good. They can work for everyone. It's that Americans have had a moral failing. White Americans have had a moral failing and not included African Americans in these opportunities. And this is kind of a personal problem that must be overcome with liberal politics. So they have this vision that America is a perfectible society as it's currently structured. But as you start to see these growing and intransigent problems, it's looking more and more like the Alexanders may be a bit of a dead end. We have to have a rethinking of society. And that rethinking is led by more radical politicians, such as the man with the cigar here, Cecil B. Moore, who leads a much more radicalized politics from the left. Think Black Panthers, think Nation of Islam, and so on. And he's kind of the local leader of the NAACP and of this more radicalized politics. Him, along with Leon Sullivan, are two of the major leaders of this politics. They desegregate Girard College. They campaign for jobs on construction sites and so on. They are out there taking politics to the streets. They see the limitations of a middle-class liberalism. As they are gaining power, what they're finding is that the African-American population continues to surge, so that by 1970, it's at 653,000 people. Fully 1 out of every 3 Philadelphians is African-American. And there is the continued backlash, the pushback against African-American rights in the education system, the job market, the housing market, and so on, led by somebody that everybody in this room, I'm sure, knows, named Frank Rizzo, right? So Rizzo is rising to power politically, head of the police force, and eventually becoming the mayor. African-Americans, as you move into the 1970s and you see the population becoming more diverse, less Black and white, but also Puerto Rican and other communities rising, you start to see alliances between African Americans, white liberals, and the Puerto Rican community as they campaign to elect men like Wilson Goode, John Street, Michael Nutter. And they are starting to come together in alliances that we can see still at play today in contemporary campaigns around issues of the carceral state, around the Black Lives Matter movement, the fight for 15, and so on. Today, the African-American population of Philadelphia has settled in at about 660,000 people, which means 43% of the population is African-American. You cannot get elected in this city without the African-American population's support. Two of the contemporary leaders who drew on that support, Mayor James Kenney, District Attorney Larry Krasner. So you can see that over the course of this book, what we've done is we've looked at demographic change, looked at economic change, and we thought about how that intersects with politics. And people have focused on gender, they focused on grassroots organizing, they focused on formal political power and some of the realignments that have taken place. So there's a lot to pull from in this book with a lot of different perspectives. So I hope this gives you a sense of kind of African-American politics over the course of the long 20th century. And with all that said, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, and that would be David Canton.
All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, good afternoon.
Can you start the PowerPoint?
Yeah, can you see it?
Yes.
All right. Here we go. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Canton, and I'm gonna read and have a discussion from my article in the book called chapter titled Building Black Philadelphia. Early histories that chronicle Black politics in Philadelphia during the first 2 decades of the 20th century through the Civil Rights Black Power era focused on elite Black men who participated in a number of social and political organizations, such as the Citizens Republican Club, CRC. Black women have only recently moved to the center of these stories. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 gave Black women such as Lena Trent Gordon, S. Willie Layton, and Maud Morissette, who had already been important activists, the opportunity to be power players in the Republican Party. They formed local political groups, organized Black women voters, and obtained appointed positions in local government. Between 1959 and 1929, the rise of Black middle-class leadership and the increase of Black voters allowed the African-American community to take advantage of white Republican Party division, and the Black vote emerged as a balance of power vote that led to more African-Americans gaining city employment and political appointments. Despite the expanding Black vote, racial discrimination continued, and when necessary, white political elites often overlooked their differences to try to stymie Black political power. So we have the first slide here of this Citizens Republican Club, Andrew F. Stevens, Amos Scott, picture of John Asbury right here, Black attorney, Christopher Perry, the owner of the Philadelphia Tribune, a very important newspaper that's still around today. These gentlemen were part of the Citizens Republican Club and part of what's called the Old Philadelphians. The small core of Old Philadelphians, led by elite Black male Republicans during the late 19th century, have formed political organizations that represented their class and community interests, and these persisted into the 20th century. In 1883, for example, Andrew F. Stevens, his father, Andrew F. Stevens Jr.'s dad, founded the Citizen Republican Club, which quickly became known as the most prosperous and successful political organization composed of colored men in the United States. The membership included prominent Black businessmen and professionals in Philadelphia, such as Amos Scott, president of the CRC 1908 to 1920, and owner of the Scott Hotel, A.I. Jones, owner of the Roadside Hotel, Andrew F. Stevens Jr., son of the CRC's founder, a real estate agent, and part owner of the Brown and Stevens Bank, John S. Asbury, attorney, and Christopher Perry, founder and owner of the Philadelphia Tribune. Scott and the CRC early on played a major role in successfully pushing Pennsylvania's Republican governor, Martin Grove Brumbaugh, for the appointment of African-American attorney John W. Parks to a special assignment position in the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, a man with the ability to deal with the heads of the party in the city and the state. They claimed he merited a robust salary of $5,000 per year and of $15 per diem. Black attorneys and newspapers played a central role in Philadelphia's Black politics. Every major city with a large African-American population had Black lawyers and influential Black newspapers, such as the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh's Courier. In 1919, Philadelphia had 19 Black lawyers, and the Tribune praised their work in its pages. Christopher Perry founded the Philadelphia Tribune in 1884 and hired G. Grant Williams as the city editor. The two men guided the Tribune into becoming one of the most influential African-American newspapers in the country. Williams had been a barber in Hartford, Connecticut, and worked as a correspondent for the Tribune. From 1903 to 1922, Williams wrote witty and critical essays and articles on racism in Philadelphia, and he castigated Black and white politicians who failed to protect Black voters and provide them with city jobs. Perry told Williams that he was in politics and too busy to bother with the paper, so Perry allowed Williams to run the paper like he owned it. All right. So here we have a picture of Black women Republicans. So obviously with the passing of the 19th Amendment, now we have Black women voters adding to the number of Black voters, which had a definite impact in Philadelphia politics. In 1920, Black women voters emerged as an important constituent for Black elected officials and the Republican Party. African Americans had the opportunity to elect 2 Black state representatives from the predominantly Black 7th and 30th Ward. With the passage of the 19th Amendment, the Tribune told its readers that suffragist Carrie Chapman Catt, speaking on behalf of the women voters of the world, argued that 1.5 million women in 29 states have the right to vote in the next presidential election. By supporting Black politicians, Black women voters could force white Republicans to appoint more African Americans to high-level positions. African American men had created social and political organizations to organize Black male voters for some time, but in 1920, the Tribune found 35,000 Black women voters in Philadelphia and a cadre of emerging Black women leaders who registered and organized them. After the passage of the 19th Amendment, Black women wasted no time getting registered and joining the Republican Party. In 1920, the Philadelphia Tribune published a number of articles praising Black women's commitment to voting. The front page of the September 4th edition of the paper noted that first colored women in the city assessed before registration, and 2 weeks later, voter registration began, and in almost every registration district, women took the lead. Unlike many men, the Tribune added, they took advantage of the first day and qualified. Black women voters' issues were child labor, high cost living, education, and democratic rule in Haiti. Because American politics is gendered, the Tribune argued Black women's political issues were, quote unquote, naturally associated with children, family, and home. Quote, their innate interest in the home encouraged women to advocate for laws that create the best possible home life for their families. Now, Black women were concerned with American imperialism in Haiti, but this journal is focused on their concern about children and their families. Most Black men relegated Black women's political interests to the family, but the Black community needed Black women's votes, and in due time, these women leaders obtained general leadership positions such as director of welfare agencies. So here we have S. Willie Layton, colored women of Philadelphia County, head of that, Margaret Corbett, Black women voters in the 30th Ward, Maud Morissette, clerk municipal court, and Lena Trent Gordon, an image of her here, special investigator, public welfare. So we see when Black women votes, Black women become important parts of the Republican Party. Many of them start receiving political appointments because they're a vital backbone of the Black Republican base and also for white Republican Party. Now, of course, in spite of Black voting power, there's still resistance on the state level. Now, in 1877, there was a Pennsylvania Civil Rights Bill, a number of late 19th century Northern Civil Rights Bill, but these bills really had no teeth and weren't really enforced. You'll find Jim Crow in Philadelphia, in northern states. So in 1915, we have what's called the Stein Bill, put up by State Legislator Bill Stein to end segregation and public accommodations. But again, there weren't enough voters in the state to vote in favor of this bill. 6 years later, the Asbury Bill, John Asbury from Philadelphia, promotes the Civil Rights Bill again to try to end segregation in Philadelphia. That bill wasn't passed. But oftentimes it turned into a debate between NAACP and local Black Philadelphia leaders. But oftentimes, rather than blaming Black voters, it's because you didn't have enough Black political power, unlike Chicago, where you have the South Side Chicago political base. Unlike New York, you have that Harlem base. Philadelphia Black folks are divided into 3 areas, South, West, and North, which really made it difficult and took longer for them to elect their first Black congressperson. But oftentimes, when you read the Tribune, you find that oftentimes Black people would blame African Americans and not look at how white resistance played a major role. People like William Vere right here in the Vere machine, okay, which they were major figures in the Republican Party, and Black Republican leaders made sure that they put pressure on Vere to ensure that there were city appointments, judgeships, city jobs, whether as low as a janitor to a court. So definitely political patronage was the name of the game back in the 20s. There were no bones about it. There's even an ad in the book that I have where Vere puts out in the Philadelphia Tribune, we spent $1.5 million on city jobs. So nowadays you don't talk politics like that, but it's the same game, right? So whether it's Bill Clinton appointing, different African Americans to the cabinet or on the federal judges, this game back in the 20s was more honest and forthright about it. If Black people vote for these folks, we want these rewards, this patronage. And this is happening whether it's Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. Patronage is part of American politics. But now we're also going to see, oh, my bad. But we're also going to see over time a new cadre of leaders who I call the new Negro generation, who were kind of viewed as the radicals. We have Raymond Pace Alexander, who's like the second generation of Black attorneys. His wife, Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander, and E. Washington Rhodes. So this group, by the 1930s and 40s, are pushing the old Philadelphians to demand more patronage. Even Alexander is threatening sometimes not to vote Republican. In fact, Alexander had changed parties 3-4 times in his career because of the resistance to appointing Black judges in Philadelphia. We have Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander, who eventually got appointed as city assistant solicitor by the late 20s, another function of Black political power, and E. Washington Rhodes got appointed as an assistant attorney general by, I think, by Kendrick, I believe, the mayor. So again, we see here that Black political power forced white Republicans to appoint Black elected officials, but still the resistance made it more difficult for Black folks to become appointed judges and to become congresspeople. So it's not till 1935 when you have the Civil Rights Bill in Pennsylvania passes, but again, because of Pittsburgh, because of Black voters in Philadelphia, with growing white liberal allies in the state, they're able to pass these civil rights laws. So pretty much in my essay, I'm just outlining how Black political politics worked from 15 to 29, but really ending how by the late 20s, you're starting to see a growing shift within a newer cadre of these new Negro leaders who are demanding more because there's a bigger Black population, there's more resources to demand more patronage, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, David. Next up will be Stan Arnold, who focuses on the next chapter in the book, which is about the Depression and World War II period. Stan.
What I focused on was the period from 1929, from the Depression to 1945. And as Jim had mentioned, unemployment in Philadelphia was extremely, extremely high, especially for African Americans, 3 times as high. And what you will witness during this period is a complete inability of the Republicans, that is on the city level, to deal with this crisis. From 1932 to 1937, they basically cut off relief. This is the Philadelphia County Emergency Relief Station on 14th and Cherry. The Democrats are financially and politically weak, and this will lead some Philadelphians, both Black and white, to look for other solutions. This is a period of intense grassroots organizing. The communist and other leftist organizations will reemerge. Philadelphia had a militant tradition, but this sort of went underground after the Red Scare of the late teens. There is an emergence of tenants leagues and unemployment councils. And in 1931, one of these unemployment councils selects an African-American woman, Martha Jeffries, to represent them at a congressional hearing in DC. in 1932, Herbert Hoover will win the city of Philadelphia, but he'll win it by about 70,000 votes, which in a city is so closely identified with the Republican parties is kind of surprising. What you will see during this period is I would have to describe it as these different coalitions forming. That is, most importantly, there are dissident Republicans. In North Philadelphia, there is a local community leader named Arbertha White, who starts her own soup kitchen and leaves the leaves the Republican Party for the Democrats, believing that they're just unable to deal with this crisis. To understand the beginnings of this transition, we have to look at a number of figures. Pictured here, Samuel Holmes, who was one of the first African Americans elected to the state legislature. Austin Norris, publisher of the Philadelphia Independent, and a leading advocate for transition to the Democrats. Marshall Shepard. Shepard will, like Holmes, will actually precede Holmes, will be elected to the state legislature in 1934. Shepard goes to Vere, who my colleague Dave Canton mentioned earlier, and says, can you run he goes to Vere's home in Atlantic City, summer home. Can you run an African-American candidate? Vere says no. Shepard says, basically, I'm going to switch to the Democrats, and I'm going to use my church in Mount Olivet in West Philadelphia as a headquarters for FDR and other candidates. Down here, you see Joseph Rainey, a magistrate. Governor George Earle. Earle, in 1934, becomes the first Democrat in a very long time to be elected governor. Earle embarks on something called the Little New Deal or the Keystone New Deal. He sponsors an incredible number of bills, many of which are passed, over 3,000. He'll certainly be an advocate for more Black participation in the Democratic Party. Here is Crystal Byrd Fawcett. She becomes the first African-American woman to be elected to a state legislature in the United States. Fawcett will also become heavily involved with the National Negro Congress, which was mentioned earlier. Fawcett is important because she also wins, in contrast to the others, in a majority white district. So the transition is, as was mentioned earlier, relatively slow. There was a lot of ticket splitting during this period, really throughout this period. However, it's the developments after 1934 which will bring more African Americans into the Democratic fold. For example, the establishment of jobs programs, the CCC and the Works Progress Administration. And this involves giving artists, such as the famous gentleman on the right, the artist Dox Thrash, opportunities. So in short, this is really going to bring more African Americans into the Democratic fold, and FDR will begin to win the city of Philadelphia by over 60% in the next few elections. However, by 1938, FDR is facing increasing problems. He begins to cut back on federal spending. Some have dubbed this the Roosevelt recession. In addition, Republicans and conservative Democrats who've been critical of the New Deal see an opportunity during this period. In the late 1930s, unemployment is still relatively high. In Philadelphia, it's around 17–18%. For the African-American population, it's about 30%. So it's not, it's been cut in a sense by half, but there's still significant hardship. This is a demonstration, and it shows the little bit of the interracial character of this period. Now, keep this in mind. There's also a growing civil rights movement that has its roots in the Quaker faith, and interracial civil rights movement. That's protesting, that's involved in Don't Buy Where You Can't Work. That's testing the Pennsylvania Equal Rights Bill, which was passed in 1935, which guarantees equal access to hotels and restaurants. They're engaging in sit-ins and things of that sort. World War II is going to further bring African Americans into the Democratic fold. In 1940, there are demonstrations as the defense industry gears up for the war. It's clear that African Americans are not getting these jobs, and certainly there's more pressure placed on FDR, and with the passage of the Fair Employment Practices law and his emergency order, more African Americans find work in the defense industry. And Philadelphia is known for shipbuilding, but this worker shown here is at the quartermaster depot in South Philadelphia, which is one of the nation's leading centers for the production of uniforms, tents, and other fabric-related war material. As mentioned before, the double V, this didn't come out too well, but is the clarion call of the civil rights, or the emerging civil rights movement in the 1940s. Victory against Nazi fascism, Japanese imperialism, and victory against racism at home. This is a protest around the time or prior to the 1944 PTC strike that my colleague Dr. Wolfinger has mentioned, which is an extremely important moment in Black Philadelphia politics, when the federal government comes in on the side, or it's perceived, of African Americans in this labor dispute, this hate strike. However, there is a backlash among some white Philadelphians, and this is evidenced by the return of Republican power in the late or in the aftermath of World War II. But there is cautious hope and optimism that with more Philadelphians supporting the Democratic Party, with a new reform movement beginning among Democratic leadership, that the future is going to be relatively bright. So that's my chapter. I hope you enjoy the book, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So
Thank you, Stan. Okay, next up, we have two presenters who are here in person in the room. The next chapter in the book actually picks up where Stan leaves off, moving into the 1950s. And we're joined by Abby, who's going to be able to walk us through events from that decade. Please.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming here and coming there. So let me begin by setting a little bit of the context of this post-war period. As you've been hearing, there's been a lot of kind of movement in political identification, right, and party identification, both among African Americans nationally and in Philadelphia. And when Joseph Clark becomes mayor in 1952, he does so as the first Democrat in 6 decades. So this really brings to bear this shift from identification with the Republican Party to identification with the Democratic Party. And he becomes the first mayor in Philadelphia under the city's new home rule charter. This charter calls for an end to racial and religious discrimination in hiring practices, and it's the first in the country to create a commission on human relations. And this commission is tasked specifically with ameliorating racial intolerance and overhauling discriminatory policies in a city that was once so racist and so destructive that in 1927, W.E.B. Du Bois marked about Philadelphia, quote, "Philadelphia is the best place to discuss race relations because there is more race prejudice here than any other city in the United States." So this new commission is on human relations comes about, and it comes about at a time when the nation is really grappling with the legacy of global conflict that Stan talked about and that Jim talked about earlier at the beginning of the talk. And this moment, right, where activists had linked fascism abroad with racism at home. And what do we do with this coming out of the war, where fascism, right, lost, and we are, sorry, I'm supposed to be looking at the camera, where fascism loses, and we try to figure out how to implement these new ideals about democracy in the United States. Out of this crisis emerges a philosophy of racial justice that brings together the idea of individual agency, right? That individual people can persuade other individual people toward better race relations, toward improved race relations, with a sense of government responsibility to create policies that foster access, that foster opportunity across racial lines. Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander, who you heard about from David, was one of the founding members of the HRC, and she and her husband, Judge Alexander, had really been a force for racial change in the city since the 1920s. And I recommend that everybody read David's book, the biography of Raymond Alexander. Their goal, Judge Alexander, Raymond Alexander later recalled, was, quote, "to make Philadelphia and Pennsylvania a city and a state where Black people could enjoy the fundamental freedoms guaranteed to them in our federal Bill of Rights," right? This idea, again, coming back to what Jim said, that our founding documents, that our system is right, and we just have to find our way back to the ideals that were written into it. The Alexanders really epitomized this post-war liberal turn in how the city and the broader nation was approaching reforming race relations. They were members of a powerful coalition of middle-class white people and professional African Americans who saw desegregation as the central goal of civil rights progress, and who counted their victories in the erosion of barriers to employment, to education, to housing, this real legal change. This breed of coalition politics complemented well the goals of Mayor Clark and his Commission on Human Relations, which sought to provide redress for individual cases of discrimination and open up the city to a growing cohort of middle-class African Americans. And that group is really important, right? This group of middle-class African Americans and professional class African Americans, this was a movement based on racial change, but not necessarily economic change. But that support wasn't universal, right? In the early 1960s, some Black Philadelphians began pushing back on this integrationist ideal as the consensus vision for civil rights in America. To a growing collection of African Americans, interracial collaboration was kind of a flawed but well-intentioned concept, born out of a particular historical moment that prioritized this class-blind inclusion, this equality of opportunity, but fell short of a full reorientation of our nation's racial hierarchy. The goal of integration, these activists charge, subverted efforts to reorient the material conditions that African Americans were living in. And they had the effect of dismantling a distinctive Black American culture and identity. It was assimilationist rather than kind of uplifting African Americans as a cultural group. In 1963, as Jim spoke of earlier, Philadelphia elected Cecil B. Moore as the new local president of the NAACP, and Moore really epitomizes this turn away from integrationist reform-minded politics. In 1960, as he rose to power, 535,000 African Americans lived in Philadelphia. This is 27% of the city's population, up from 13% 2 decades earlier, and up from 5.1% in 1900. Though many Black families had moved to the city's outer edges by that point, nearly 1/3 still lived in North Philadelphia, among the most marginalized areas in the city. These Black residents of North Philly had been alienated from the city's power structure. They had the lowest education rates and employment rates in the city. They had limited access to medical care, substandard housing, to fresh groceries, and many of them felt voiceless at the same time that the expectations for inclusion were rising with the spread of civil rights activism around the city and around the nation. So when Moore becomes president of the local NAACP, he pledges to empower the residents of North Philadelphia. He said this group of people that had been excluded from the Commission of Human Rights efforts to change racial tensions within the city's power structure. And he actually pits himself and his ideas against those of folks like the Alexanders. And he starts to create this dichotomy about not only what activism meant, but also what Blackness meant in the context of Philadelphia politics in the 1960s. His rise to power in 1963 really unmasks these limitations of the integrationist agenda that I spoke about a few minutes ago and that had occupied City Hall for the previous decade. And Moore promises to rebuild the ideas of racial justice. He says, we need to move past the victories of Black professionals gaining token advances and to cultivate a broad-based campaign geared toward addressing the material needs of the Black masses. He pledges to support a kind of one race agenda, one class agenda, rather than dividing African Americans by class. His ideals align with a real reorientation of the national collective effort towards civil rights activism, a movement away from a vision of justice that prioritizes equal opportunity and bans discriminatory practices, and toward a more radicalized and a more Black-led effort grounded in street protests and consumer boycotts. Moore's own leadership was short-lived. His more militant tactics, which were combined with a relatively flamboyant personality and routine charges of anti-Semitism, often drew the ire of the NAACP's white membership and national leadership. And in 1966, he was effectively run out of power. But his rise laid bare for many of the failures of liberalism to create meaningful change for African Americans throughout the city. And in the years to follow, Philadelphia's Black leadership worked to redefine their priorities and reconcile the push for socioeconomic transformation with the fight for inclusion in the city's power structure. And I think that's where the next chapter and Clem pick up.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Abby. Right, we have one final presentation and we'll open up for questions and conversation with the audience. And Clem, you are going to take up the 1960s once we get your PowerPoint loaded, right?
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank HSP for hosting us. I want to yet again say that it is a real honor to be with my colleagues discussing these projects. I want to move fairly quickly into a discussion on the 1960s, sort of building on some of these major themes that you've been hearing. By the mid-1960s, a combination of Black migration, entrenched discrimination in labor and housing markets, urban renewal, industrial flight, poverty, hyper-segregation, and white exodus, all of which led to economic and social underdevelopment of Black working class communities like West Philadelphia and North Central Philadelphia, which my colleague Abby just talked about. Overdevelopment of the city's suburbs and an erosion of Philadelphia's tax base. All of this signals something far worse than the failure of civil rights liberalism to address these issues. These changes overshadowed the fact that by the arrival of the post-industrial era, the city's political structure was changing. Philadelphia's political landscape went from a two-party system to essentially, yet again, a single-party machine structure led by white ward-based Democratic regulars who dominated City Hall, City Council, and the state capitol in Harrisburg. There are three key factors that I lay out in this particular essay that help to explain it. One is the fact that despite the reformist energy during the post-war years that my colleagues talked about earlier, these years that eliminated nearly 7 decades of dominance under the Republican machine, the 1950s coalition of progressive middle to upper middle class whites, along with trade unionists, Black civil rights activists, and white row house regular Democrats, which resembled the New Deal coalition, right? By this post-war period, the 1960s, it all began to dissolve because of factionalism. Second, as a result of reapportionment and gerrymandering, white Democratic machine leaders were able to solidify their influence over the city's wards and exerted tremendous authority over the largest registration of Black voters, thereby controlling the balance of power. Third, the tactic of redrawing political boundaries entrenched the power of white-dominated political organizations that determined the nomination and election of Black candidates. This process virtually eliminated the ability of African-American political leaders, organizations, or actually Black political leaders to develop the types of structures and the types of representation that Abby talked about. And it severely marginalized Black leaders, even those who were in the party and recognized by the party. It marginalized their ability to negotiate policy for working class Black folk. Equally important, what I lay out here is that before the rise of the Black Political Forum in 1968, which gave us ultimately Wilson Goode as mayor, it is this moment between the rise of Cecil B. Moore and his ultimate downfall from power. He runs for mayor in 1967 and loses. But it's in this period that we really see the roots of an independent Black political structure that is significantly influenced by Black nationalism. Okay. So just to share a little bit more before I go into somewhat of an explanation, concurrent with the political transformations that hit Philadelphia and its metropolitan region during the post-industrial period, a new generation of Black protest leaders surfaced. These leaders explicitly based themselves in the city's Black working class neighborhoods rather than the offices of liberal reform organizations located in Center City. As historian Matthew Countryman has rightly argued, these neighborhood-based leaders did not openly question civil rights liberalism's faith in the legal protection of individual liberty and interracial coalitions as keys to eradicating racial injustice. They didn't question that. What they ultimately questioned was this exclusive focus on legislative means and the sole reliance, I should say, on professional middle-class leadership. These were the key critiques. They also talked about how legislative structures and this over-reliance on a professional middle-class leadership failed to realize what was happening in Black communities. The growing pressures from urban blight, juvenile delinquency, police brutality. These were issues that were mounting as this liberal organization was continuing to bring forth promises of a better tomorrow through liberalism. To the right. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So on the screen now, we are looking at two of these leaders who emerges. These folks really start in the period just before the 1960s, right? And so by the late 1950s, you see the rise of Reverend Leon Sullivan of the Zion Baptist Church. He is the individual who is on the right if you're looking at the screen. One of the things that he did was to really focus on looking at how neighborhood leaders can develop local solutions to address local problems. And as a result, he develops what is called the Opportunities Industrial Center. This was specifically designed to try to train young people, particularly in the north and north central Philadelphia area, on how to get a job, right? This was a critical step that he was taking. On the left, we see Malcolm X, who once again emerges with a very specific message about the importance of focusing on the community, right? This is the moment where he starts to advocate for the centrality of community control. If we could advance this one. Excellent. In addition to him, folks like John Churchville, who was a former field secretary with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, he, along with others, founded what was called the Freedom Library. The fall of 1965, Churchville, whose image is not up here, Churchville, along with Walter Palmer, who you see there on the left, and Father Paul Washington, Episcopal priest, who is on the right, he both came together to found what was called the All Black Political Organization, otherwise known as Black People's Unity Movement. It operated off of the principle that Malcolm X espoused. Malcolm X had articulated this need for an all Afro-American solution to African-American problems, and that it should be based inside the neighborhood. He stressed, as did this organization, the importance of Black nationalism, exhibited by racial unity, Black consciousness, and yet again, community control over key political, social, and economic institutions operating within Black communities. Next slide. Coming back to Cecil B. Moore. The post-industrial period also witnessed the ascension of Philadelphia's new messiah, right? Moore, to the presidency of the NAACP, and arguably the most effective militant protest leader. Moore's elevation as president symbolized, as my colleague Abby has said, a rejection of the middle-class liberal leadership. And yet the most dominant scholarship on Moore sees him largely as a protest leader. What's interesting about Moore is that he was effective not only in the pressure politics, but he also exerted significant influence in electoral politics, right? He understood that the key was not merely protest to bring attention to the issues that were still unresolved in communities like North Central Philadelphia, but that they had to lay control of the political apparatus. And what is the central political apparatus? The ward structure. And it takes us right back to my colleague David Canton's essay, right? In many ways, what you see happening in the 1920s and this new Negro movement, this emergence of a new form of radicalism, right? This is the same era in which we see the rise of Marcus Garvey, right? This is the rise of militant Black nationalism, right? Well, after the Second Red Scare in the 1950s, what do we see in Black nationalism? The reemergence of a militant form of nationalism, but essentially arguing the same thing, that it is the community, right? And it is the ward structure, and power must be in the hands of the people if their issues are going to have any significant attention. It is in 1964 that Moore first begins to apply his strategy, connecting Black nationalist principles to the electoral arena. And he does so by taking on the incumbent Charles Wiener, who was a Jewish resident who lived largely in the Winfield section of the 52nd Ward. He was the Democratic incumbent in the 7th state senatorial seat, which covered much of West Philadelphia. And it had an overwhelming Black population. For Moore, this was the prime target, right? And what he did was he basically silently recruited independent candidates, one of whom was Reverend Marshall Lorenzo Shepard Jr., if we could advance. Now, on the left is the State Senator Wiener. And on the right, to your extreme right in the gown, or in the gown, that is Reverend Lorenzo Shepard Jr. To the extreme left of him, or right of him, I should say, is his father, right? And what Moore basically did was he tapped into him and several others to take on Wiener and to ultimately launch what was the first third-party option. This was the first time in the city of Philadelphia, under the era of Democratic control, that an independent party that was completely coming out of Black communities was challenging the Democratic Party for its control. It didn't go unnoticed. Catherine Woodard, who was a African-American civic leader and publisher of the Philadelphia Independent, basically said, this looks like Moore's doings. She charged him with being a dictator and a person who drew up only Black candidates. Well, what is this about, right? This is the first real shock, right? Because what had happened, what was going on since then, it was about integration. It was about making sure that somehow, some way, that this sort of post-war reform liberalist model was still the key to follow. So all of a sudden, you see for the first time since the Democrats are in power, a slate of Black candidates it wasn't hard to figure out who the person was that orchestrated it, right? So she takes him on in her favor in the Philadelphia Independent, which historically had been a Democratic leaning organ. And so what Moore did, he didn't waste time. He struck back quickly, right? He basically concluded that Woodard was a threat to race pride. He said, it is rather obvious that she sought to prepare her readers for her forthcoming endorsement of a white candidate, Charles R. Wiener, in a senatorial district, the 7th, where the Negro voting strength is more than 3-to-1. Right? I mean, so he makes it very clear. This is the problem that we have in predominantly Black communities, where we will not be able to have our voices heard, because not only is there an incumbent there that is selected by the machine, they have Black surrogates who can shape public opinion, right? So despite Moore's efforts to unseat Wiener, he loses. But you can see why he ultimately seeks to go after the electoral machinery. Because in the summer of 1964, there is a fatal riot. Could we move? Excellent. The riot that happens in North Philadelphia is emblematic of the broader issue that Moore was talking about, right? And it is after this particular moment, Moore had been in Center City because, in Atlantic City at the same time this riot unfolds in North Central Philadelphia, the Democratic National Convention is taking place in Atlantic City, right? This is the hallmark of American liberalism, right? The Democrats are seeking to yet again run a liberal program, and just 60 miles, my orientation is a little off here, about 60 miles away, you have this riot that's unfolding. And it's in this moment that Moore, if we can move to the next slide, that Moore achieves real fame when Time magazine comes to him, their Time magazine is basically asking, where is the boss, right? And he very aggressively says, I am the goddamn boss, right? Once again, you're not recognizing who I am or who we are. And so that became extremely significant. The following year, as my colleague Abby lays out, he gets reelected to the NAACP. And it's important to note that the NAACP is not subdivided at this particular moment, right? It is a single organization that is addressing all of the issues of Black Philadelphia. And in this particular moment, he also does something extraordinary, right? He leads Black Philadelphians, youth, middle-aged, gang members in a series of campaigns that finally brings an end to the anti-Black racial barriers at Girard College in 1968. In 1966, something happens, very important, right? Keep in mind, my colleague Abby talked about the fact that there were approximately 525,000 Black people in Philadelphia, and a third of them in North Central Philadelphia. Before 1966, North Philadelphia constituted the 4th Congressional District. The 4th Congressional District. It is in this moment in 1958 where we see the emergence of Nix as the first Black congressman in that area, right? Now, I just need to put this in context, because Philadelphia, before Chicago, Philadelphia had been expected to bring the first Black congressman after all Blacks had been expelled from Congress during the end of the 19th century. George White ran in 1912 and lost. In fact, George White had more support when he ran in the 19th century and became a congressman in North Carolina than had in Philadelphia in 1912, right? But I want to give you an understanding as to why it took so long. Unlike Chicago, which gave us Blacks the first congressman in 1930. In Chicago, the residential structure was wholly segregated. It was completely segregated. In Philadelphia, you didn't have a structure of racial segregation when it came to where people live. That happens over time, right? What you have is resistance to empowering Black people. That is very, very important to understand. But that being said, in 1966, what had been we can go to the next slide. What had been the 4th Congressional District, which before Nix had been under, that seat had been controlled by a white candidate. What happens in 1966 is that there was a new reapportionment plan, and the congressional seats in Pennsylvania, actually the congressional seats in Philadelphia had gone from 6 to 5. What had been the 4th Congressional District, and I don't know if we can enlarge this so that you can see the wards, but I want to show you, I'm going to lay out the wards so that you gain an understanding of just how concentrated that Black population was. The 24th Ward, the 28th Ward, the 29th Ward, the 32nd Ward, the 37th Ward, the 38th Ward, and the 47th Ward all constituted the 4th Congressional District. All of it was an area that reflected a deep concentration of Black Philadelphians. The new 2nd Ward, the new 2nd Congressional District after 1966 took in parts of West Philadelphia, some of North Philadelphia, Northwest Philadelphia, South Philadelphia. As we move into South Philadelphia, we're getting into an area where there is less Black concentration, Center City and the western suburb of Lower Marion in Montgomery County. If we can move to the next. That's Nix, so that you have some understanding. If we can move to the next. In 1966, Moore takes on Nix again and loses. The following year in 1967, he runs against James Tate for mayor and he loses. We can advance to the next slide. 1968, after Moore has lost, we see the emergence of the 2nd generation of Black independent leaders with the Black Political Forum in Hardy Williams and John White Sr., whose face is not there, and Wilson Good. And like the previous group, these individuals emerge because it is a rejection of civil rights liberalism, and it's a rejection of the Democratic Party and the Democratic machine itself. I just want to, if we could just move one more slide. I just want to make a connection here. This moment of Black nationalism, this rejection of liberalism also manifests itself with the rise of student activism at the University of Pennsylvania. To the next slide. These two connect to what we recognize as University City, which had been prior to that the Black Bottom. This was the result of post-war liberalism in the form of the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority working with the West Philadelphia Corporation, which was a joint venture including the University of Pennsylvania and Drexel. Penn was the largest shareholder, hence the name University City. Next slide. The ability to declare the Black Bottom to be blighted allowed the Redevelopment Authority to invoke eminent, once that was invoked, they used eminent domain to completely take over the area. These group of predominantly white students were ultimately transformed by the period of civil rights, and they were working with local Black leaders, Walter Palmer being one of them, to try to resist the displacement of some 2,700 families from the Black bottom, right? Go to the next slide. You see here, they were able to send a message that to the Board of Trustees. By now, 800 students are protesting. They were able to send a message to the Board of Trustees at the University of Pennsylvania, which ultimately altered the plan of Penn to completely level the area. The one thing that they succeeded in doing is bringing forth low rent housing in the form of university city townhouses, right? And yet here we are today. Penn engaging yet again in the expansion. And they had made a promise that those homes would constitute a form of trust. It is the result of what can happen through social activism. In other words, Moore and all of those leaders were correct. This final slide here, this is Detroit in the 1960s. That on the far is Milwaukee in the 1960s, and of course today, the same policies. It all comes back to the importance of this moment, where if there is not power concentrated within the communities, these things will happen, right? And so what I hope you take away from our book is the importance that community activism and community power plays in understanding history and what it can tell us about moving forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Clem. Thank you. So we're going to move to, we have an opportunity for a little bit of question and answer conversation with the audience, if we have any time left. And just Dan, let you take over.
Time.
Yeah.
I want to ask one question of everybody on the panel, and so if our collaborators in the Zoom could come back on. We are the host of National History Day Philly, so HSB has taken this on, and we are so encouraged when we see students in our reading rooms or when they're on the Temple archives. What would you direct them to? What stories you've touched on so many, and we have seen projects come both to segregation through our college. We have seen the 1944 transit strike. Where are you going to direct them? If you could direct them to one project in our archives or Temple's archives for a high school audience. I know we have some high school teachers on Zoom as well.
Do you want to start?
But this is a one sentence. answer.
Absolutely.
No, you can start.
Pressure on you. Thank you. So here at the Historical Society, the Albert Greenfield papers are a phenomenal collection about the economics and society of Philadelphia. There's a great collection on the transit industry as well that has been undermined significantly. I would say at Temple's Urban Archives, the Evening Bulletin Morgue is a treasure trove for understanding all aspects of Philadelphia history, and it's easily searchable for students doing projects.
I would say that I echo what my colleague has said. I've had a chance to go through some of the Greenfield papers here, and I think he's absolutely correct in that. I would say that the looking at the archives of the Philadelphia Tribune would be very, very, very good. I mean, we have only tapped just the surface of it, right? And this is the richness that it brought out. So I would direct the students to really begin to navigate the archives and start to dig into the digital records of the Philadelphia Tribune.
I think those are great suggestions. The one I would add is a collection I'm actually currently doing research in, which is at the Urban Archives, or now the Special Collections Resource Center at Temple. And that's the Special Commission on Move Investigations, which kind of pulls together, right, so much of the history that we're talking about, and then the legacy of the move bombing on where Philadelphia is today in terms of the carceral state and the relationship between kind of the city and the people that live here.
Dr. Arnold or Dr. Canton,
I'll go. I recommend, I did a paper years ago in grad school on Floyd Logan and Educational Equality League. So talking about the whole AP African Studies here in Florida, they were talking about textbooks in the 30s. So this has been a long history issue, so the Education Equality League were organizing to, to fight against, to have better representation in textbooks. In addition, you have the Philadelphia Tribune, which will cover these events. So they're right, that's a project in itself right there. Floyd Logan, I think his papers are at Temple Archives, I believe, if I'm right. And then obviously the Philadelphia Tribune, and they have all the back editions. That's a great project for students.
Thank you. David, are you still there?
Yeah, I would say certainly at Temple, the records of Fellowship House, the Fellowship Commission, and various community-based organizations that can be found there, and certainly those at HSP as well. So I mean, this is, I think those are extremely important for looking to what is happening in the neighborhoods across Philadelphia.
Thank you for answering that, my panelists. We are out of time, but I want to take a minute to thank everybody for joining us. Just know you will be getting a recording of this. We will be putting connections on how to purchase the book. They'll be coming out to you. If you do have questions that we didn't get to today, you'll be able to email us at programs@hsp.org, and we will get them to the panelists as well. But Jim, thank you again for assembling this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for everyone in the room, and thank you for everyone on Zoom, especially to our members who have joined us today. Without your support, we cannot host these events. So we hope to see you in the reading room too soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.